So here we're going to look at the tariff showdown between Andrew Jackson and the state of South Carolina, who is not to be trifled with, my friends. We certainly see that in the 1830s, and we're going to see that again in the late 1850s going into 1860. So again, hopefully we remember what a tariff is. Remember, that's certainly something that Alexander Hamilton wanted and he got. It wasn't the biggest tariff. And then there's going to be another tariff sort of during that American system BTN era. And then they go for an even bigger tariff in 1828, known as the Tariff of 1828, but no one calls it that. It's known as the Tariff of Abomination or Tariff of Abominations. And this was actually passed during John Quincy Adams' presidency, which makes a lot more sense because, again, he's more of a BTN guy. But Andrew Jackson inherits it. So he comes in, and you would think that Andrew Jackson is anti-tariff. He's a guy from the South, sort of this Southwest, if you want to think about sort of how he fancied himself, not the Southwest that we know today, but down in Tennessee. And it's part of the federal government. So it's weird because he should hate it, but because now it's like his federal government, he's now going to defend it. And this is part of just the challenge of understanding the enigma that is Andrew Jackson. Like, he should have been on South Carolina's side the whole time, but he wasn't. Okay. So what's important here is that the tariff, like almost all tariffs, is designed to protect Northern manufacturers. So the South feels aggrieved from the get-go. Like, why is it that you are, again, the federal government, seemingly protecting them and wanting to sacrifice us? And when I say sacrifice, it's because the South felt, particularly South Carolina, which really had struggled with the sort of that panic of 1819, sort of had stayed with them throughout all of the 1820s. In addition, South Carolina is the highest proportion of slaves. And so I'll get to the slavery part in a second, but they understand that if the United States has a tariff on European goods, then European countries put a tariff on American goods, particularly on cotton. So they're like, back to that old farmer dilemma where it's, we have to buy more expensive, crappier goods here in America because you want to protect Northern manufacturers. And we're getting screwed over in Europe because they won't buy our goods because they're now so much more expensive because they put a tariff on our goods. Now, there's also another element, and this is sort of tough to get your head around, but it's important to understand. South Carolina voiced, or at least talked about internally, a concern that many Southern states had. That was, if they can make a law that is so blatantly for the North and against the South, what's to say that they won't sort of continue down this slippery slope and get rid of slavery, which would be pro-North, anti-South? So they really saw this as, we have to do something to stop what could happen down the road. It's sort of like the Stamp Act back in the day. Like, it wasn't the price, but the principle. It's, we got to stop it now before, back then it was before the British get out of control, or here it's before, these Northerners get out of control. So South Carolina releases something known as the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. Well, what's crazy about this is it's secretly written by the Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun. Now, John C. Calhoun is a brilliant political mind. We first saw him as a good-looking guy who comes a scary war hawk way back before the War of 1812. He's actually the vice president for John Quincy Adams and then stays on for Andrew Jackson. And the South Carolina Exposition and Protest basically says, we won't enforce this tariff. And if you force us to do so, we will nullify it. Going back to this whole idea of nullification, which we saw in the Virginia-Kentucky resolutions back, written by Jefferson and Madison against the Alien and Sedition Acts. And then they say, and if you won't really allow us to nullify it, we may secede. So again, sort of compact theory all over again. We formed the Constitution because states came first. And if we don't like something, we can nullify it. Now, quite honestly, what South Carolina is saying is we get to determine the constitutionality of laws, which John Marshall ruled in 1803 in Marbury versus Madison. That's the federal government's job. That's the Supreme Court's job. So they're, some, quarter of a decade later, basically saying we dismiss the idea of the Supreme Court as the overall arbiter, and we're going to decide. So again, did they have legal standing to do it? No. Not necessarily to nullify, but at the same time, like, it's still a new country. Things are still in flux. Now, here's the showdown. Congress actually hears what South Carolina is saying, and they say, okay, we'll give you a new tariff. It's slightly lower. South Carolina says, again, what's so hard for you to understand? We don't like tariffs. They hurt us. They help the North. And they actually said, this is no more than sugar plums. Like, you aren't hearing us. We're not down with this at all. So, true to their word, as South Carolina is and will be, let's just think about 1860 when they're the first to secede, they form a special convention and they nullify, they're quote, the nullies. They nullify both the tariff of 1828, the original tariff abominations, and the one in 1832, the reduced tariffs. So they're like, middle finger, boom. What's up now, federal government? We said we were going to do it, and we did it. Now, Jackson, again, not a fan of a tariff. Like, we got to understand that. Like, total contradiction. But Andrew Jackson, what we know more than anything, is not a fan of anyone opposing him. That's why his body is literally full of lead from duels. He privately threatens to kill everyone who's involved in leading this insurrection. I mean, including like John C. Calhoun, who'd formerly been his vice president and has now left to go back and become a senator from South Carolina. But publicly, he's like, listen, I'm not going to allow them to do this. He says to Congress, will you allow me to use the military to go down and force this tariff to be collected? Now, again, he goes through all constitutional, channels. He gets a law passed through Congress that he's going to sign. He doesn't just take the military and go do it himself. Okay. So this bill is called the force bill. Like, I'm going to force them to collect the tariff. Now, South Carolina, again, not to be trifled with, says, all right, you're going to bring your military. We're going to get our state militia ready to go. We're talking like 10,000 members of the state militia that are ready to forcibly defend the borders of South Carolina so that this tariff, which they nullified, cannot be enforced. So everyone's on edge. So again, you hear that, and Henry Clay's like, what? You guys need a compromise? Fresh off my success at the Missouri Compromise in 1820, I'm here for you, okay? So Henry Clay actually does work with Andrew Jackson a bit on this. It's, again, got to be signed off by Jackson. And the compromise tariff of 1833, the second of three compromises that Henry Clay's involved in, lowers the tariff over 10 years. I believe your reading actually says 9 years, but I've always heard it as 10 years, to what we call pre-tariff abomination levels. So it's actually going to bring that tariff down into the 1840s so that it gets reduced. It doesn't go away all at once, but it gets reduced. Now, South Carolina is going to rescind its, nullification. So, okay, we'll accept the tariff if we know the tariff is going to go down over 10 years. But who wins this? Like, is South Carolina the winner because they got the tariff down over 10 years? Is Andrew Jackson the winner because the nation is saved? In many ways, it's Jackson's nemesis, Henry Clay, who gets to say, I bring Band-Aids, I solve problems. But what's amazing is South Carolina, just showing how much swag it has, they do a final middle finger. Even after they rescind their nullification, they're like, we nullify the force bill. Even though it's what we call a moot point and it doesn't matter, they're just like, we believe so much in nullification that we're never giving up on it. Okay. So it's really interesting to think about, like, their nullification of the force bill was completely meaningless. But they're saying, listen, states have rights and the federal government cannot run roughshod over us. Keep that in mind. Almost 3 decades later, when they're so pissed off about the election of Abraham Lincoln that they're like, we're out, forming our own country. See you later. Okay. So the next one we're going to look at is the bank showdown.